Hey everyone! So today we'll be going through a post I saw on Instagram by Leah Thomas, the founder of the blog Intersectional Environmentalist. She does great work and I appreciate her content, but I disagree with this particular post and the way it was framed. I agree with some of her criticisms of mainstream vegan advocacy, but I think in general this post conveys a message that leads to further confusion about what veganism fundamentally is. It's not fair to say you must be vegan to be an environmentalist. To start, I would agree. The majority of environmentalists are not vegan, so personally, I think it's unproductive to go around telling people who identify as environmentalists that they can't call themselves environmentalists. However, considering the enormous negative impact that animal agriculture has on the planet, eating animal products as a self-proclaimed environmentalist is akin to driving a Hummer. Label yourself as you see fit, but if you saw a climate activist driving a Hummer, you'd be right to think that their choices were inconsistent with their values. Setting aside the ecological destructiveness of the animal agriculture industries, speciesism as an ideology is incompatible with environmentalism, which I will elaborate on in a bit. She goes on to list 10 reasons why she believes that it's unfair to say that you must be vegan to be an environmentalist. Number 1, some people live in food apartheid. This is true, but food apartheid is defined as a lack of access to high-quality fresh foods. I go into more detail about this in my video on white veganism, but it's not the literal selection of food in these areas that make it more difficult to be vegan. Processed vegan food is available at convenience stores and fast food chains. It's the cumulative challenges associated with poverty that make lifestyle changes in general more difficult. I think Leah is right that we should attack the systems that make lifestyle changes more challenging rather than blame and shame individuals. We must address this issue at the systemic level because systemic problems cannot be overcome at the individual level. Organizations such as the Food Empowerment Project address this issue in their advocacy and fight for food justice while upholding a vegan ethic. The main issue that I have with this point is that it frames veganism as a diet rather than an ethic. The definition of veganism includes the very important qualifier as far as possible and practicable. In other words, if it were true that a 100% plant-based diet were impossible to adhere to given your circumstances, you could still adhere to the vegan ethic and seek to exclude all forms of animal exploitation as far as possible and practicable. If you are living paycheck to paycheck and the cheap shampoo that was tested on animals is all you can afford, no one has the authority to take away your vegan card. Number 2, some people can't be vegan due to their health. Okay, I want to start out by saying that if there were a legitimate medical condition that required animal protein for someone to live healthfully, I would have to make an exception for the few people with said medical condition, just as I make exceptions for adopted carnivorous companion animals. I am open to new evidence, but given the evidence available, I am unconvinced that such a medical condition exists. Physiologically, we are herbivorous animals. Of course, behaviorally, we're omnivorous, and technically, we are capable of digesting meat. But cats are technically capable of digesting plants, yet we label them as carnivores because of their anatomy. Human anatomy resembles that of other herbivores, not so much omnivores. There are tens of thousands of edible plants, and many ways to eat as a vegan. Under the vegan umbrella, you can design a diet that is specific to your medical needs, with a vastly different macronutrient profile than someone else's. So when people say that everybody's different and no one diet fits all, this is true, but a vegan diet is a broad category. Food is made up of macronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. There is no essential nutrient found in animal products that cannot be obtained from non-animal sources. Meat is not a macronutrient. The flesh of sea animals is not the only source of omega-3s. Eating chicken periods for B12 is unnecessary when you can just take a supplement. Low-fiber vegan foods exist. There are plenty of vegans out there with nut, soy, and gluten allergies, and all kinds of medical conditions who make it work. And it is the scientific consensus that a well-planned vegan diet is suitable for humans at all stages of life. What's frustrating about people saying that some people can't be vegan for their health is that it lets a whole bunch of people off the hook, feeling justified in consuming animal products because they tried to be vegan and it didn't work for them. Many people claim that they can't be vegan for health reasons, but their claims don't survive scrutiny. Their stories don't add up, and there are alternative explanations for their problems that make a whole lot more sense. For one, there is a ton of evidence that illustrates the effects of stress on the body, particularly digestion and skin. Two, malnutrition is usually the result of caloric restriction, so of course you will feel better if you start introducing more calorically dense foods into your diet. Three, the power of suggestibility. People are heavily influenced by their peers and celebrities, so when they see influencers quitting veganism, it plants a seed of doubt in their mind. 4. The power of placebo. The placebo effect provides an explanation for why they notice such drastic health improvements in such a short period of time. And number 5, having too high of expectations for how they should feel. A plant-based diet is not a cure-all. Healthy people still get sick and stressed, break out, and feel low energy from time to time. Not all health problems are related to diet. Promoting veganism as this miracle diet does a disservice to the animals because it creates unrealistic expectations. And when those expectations aren't met, people go back to eating animal products. The last thing I'll say on this point, because we gotta move on, is that as far as possible and practicable would apply in this context as well. If you absolutely had to consume animal products to live healthfully, you could still adhere to the vegan ethic and avoid supporting animal exploitation as far as possible and practicable. 3. Being vegan doesn't mean you live sustainably in other areas. True, but you could say that vegans who consume a ton of single-use plastic and support fast fashion are not living consistently with their values. And you'd be right. In the same sense, vegans aren't wrong to point out that meat-eating environmentalists are not living in alignment with their values. 4. Buying certain vegan foods can be costly. It's true that certain vegan alternatives like mock meats and cheeses are unaffordable to some. I think it's important to acknowledge that yes, it is easier to be vegan if you have money. It requires more willpower to avoid animal products if you can't afford taste-equivalent alternatives to your favorite comfort foods. This is why I think that the people who should be reaching out to low-income communities are the vegans who can relate to their struggle. To pass judgment on someone living in food apartheid for buying a milkshake from McDonald's while you sit in the comfort of your home eating a $6 pint of vegan Ben & Jerry's is a bit unfair. 5. It is elitist to say that. I agree that it is somewhat elitist to say that being vegan is so easy because it's not easy for everyone. But it is easier than most people think it is, and it is possible for people living in poverty to adhere to a vegan ethic. I think if you unpack what is being said here, it's not elitist to say that speciesism is incompatible with environmentalism. However, I can understand that saying, "You can't call yourself an environmentalist unless you're vegan," comes across as elitist to Black and Indigenous environmental activists. Gatekeeping is not productive. 6. Black and Indigenous people of color globally have lived with vegetarian diets before it was cool, and are often left out of the white vegan conversation. Again, this frames veganism as a diet. Following a vegetarian diet is not the same as holding an anti-speciesist ideology. I don't have much else to say except that anti-speciesist ideology has roots in many different cultures, and yes, we should amplify the voices of people of color in the vegan movement. 7. You can support regenerative ranching/farming that helps reverse the impacts of climate change. Animal farming is not sustainable. It's not the way we do it that's the problem, it's the demand that's the problem. Contrary to popular belief, grass-fed beef is actually worse for the environment because it requires more land and grass-fed cows emit more methane. Allan Savory's method of regenerative ranching has been debunked by ecologists. Consuming animal flesh and secretions is inherently less sustainable than consuming plants because raising livestock requires more resources. Perhaps in a world with a massively reduced demand for animal products, we could farm animals sustainably. But in no way does farming animals help reverse the impacts of climate change. Citation needed. 8. I don't think you can be an environmentalist while being a racist, but look at environmental circles. Unrelated, I digress. I agree that it is extremely inconsistent to be an environmentalist and also a racist. For the same underlying reason, I believe speciesism is incompatible with environmentalism. Why do we care about the environment in the first place? What is it that we're protecting? Ultimately, we are aiming to preserve the habitats of sentient beings. We care about the environment because we care about sentient life. I elaborate on this in my video, Human Rights, Animal Rights, and Environmentalism are one and the same. This is not to say that all life is equal. I'm not equating people of color with cows, pigs, and chickens. I elaborate on that in my video, Dismantling Human Supremacy. It's interesting that she says, unrelated, I digress, because I think the whole concept of race is highly relevant to discussions of speciesism. Ath and Silko illustrate this in their book Afroism. The human-animal divide is the ideological bedrock underlying the framework of white supremacy. The negative notion of the animal is the anchor of this system. The notion of the animal as subhuman is the conceptual vehicle for justified violence. Since racism requires this notion of animality, since racism and race thinking would fail to make sense without animality, those of us interested in resisting or combating racism need to take seriously why the status of the animal is what it is. Non-humans, subhumans, however you refer to us, we are all props for a narrative about the human, a small group of people that are not just Homo sapiens, but an ideal type of Homo sapiens. We tend to be blind to the fact that in both the narrative of speciesism and the narrative of racism, the members of the losing side both fall short of real human status, and as a result, their suffering and their death are mundane, normal, and expected. 9. People have differing values and ethics when it concerns animals/animal agriculture, sometimes influenced by cultural identity and religion. This is an argument for moral relativism. You could say the exact same thing about female genital mutilation. People have different values concerning women and women's bodies, influenced by their cultural identity and religion. There are many facets of culture, and upholding cultural tradition can be a beautiful thing. But culture is never a justification for violence. Religion is not a justification for infringing on the rights of others. Finally, number 10. But being vegan is actually less expensive. Okay, but it's wrong to shame people in poverty that might just want to feed their families and tell them what to do with their limited income. It's okay if someone would rather eat their cultural foods versus kale. Again, I agree that it's wrong to shame people living in poverty. I think that privileged vegans should focus on tackling the root cause of poverty and removing the barriers that make it more difficult for people, rather than telling people to just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and eat beans and rice. However, quite a few people who claim that they can't go vegan because vegan food is too expensive could make it work. They're just lacking the education and the motivation. Educating people on how to be vegan on a budget, or simply stating that it is possible to be vegan and poor, is not the same as shaming people. A lot of times, people will interpret vegan advocacy as shaming because of their own cognitive dissonance. It's projection. I've been vegan for 8 years, and I know a lot of vegans, so trust me when I say that you can be the most kind, compassionate, intersectional vegan. But if you are vocal about animal rights in any capacity, you will be accused of being aggressive, preachy, self-righteous, and judgmental. As for telling people what to do with their limited income, I get why it's a touchy subject. But we have to remember the victims of their food choices. They should factor into the equation here. It's not like vegans are interested in telling people what to do and how to spend their money because we get some thrill out of it. We are interested in speaking up for the billions of animals who are oppressed by the ideology of human supremacy. To her last point, it's okay if someone would rather eat their cultural foods versus kale. Let's unpack this. It's okay if someone would rather slit the throat of an innocent animal than eat a plant that grows out of the ground. No, this is not okay. Culture is not a justification for violence. I know she's being hyperbolic here, but there's so much more to vegan cuisine than kale. That was the end of her tweet, but she reposted it on Instagram with a lengthy caption. While I'm in absolute opposition of factory farming, I think that even if you're mostly plant-based / 100% vegan, it's important to still be critical of the movement. It's not mutually exclusive, and it's unfair of us to assume everyone's financial situations. For those of us with the privilege to eat fully vegan, plant-based or mostly plant-based, we should recognize that vegan doesn't always equal cruelty-free or environmentally friendly. Yes, it is important to still be critical of the movement if you're a part of the movement. But from my understanding, she is mostly plant-based, and given what she's written here, she's not in opposition to speciesism. So she is critiquing the vegan movement from the outside, not the inside. And as I'm sure she can understand, it's frustrating when people critique a movement from the outside because they often mischaracterize it. In the comments and in her stories, she insisted that this post was not anti-vegan. I believe her when she says she supports her vegan friends. But in her post, she is upholding the ideology of human supremacy, and that is why vegans like myself had a problem with it, not because we're against internal critique. The phrase, "for those of us with the privilege to eat fully vegan," frames veganism as a diet rather than an ethic. And it's true that vegans don't always make cruelty-free and environmentally friendly choices. But the vegan ethic, applied consistently, is cruelty-free and environmentally friendly. Animal rights, human rights, and environmentalism are one and the same. I think we should shame the system that has led to the exploitation of people, planet, and animals, and not individual people. I will never use my platform to promote the meat industry because I don't live in food apartheid, have access to my farmer's market, and food that's better for the planet. However, I will not use this platform to shame people who are not vegan or plant-based, especially because of cultural, religious, health, and accessibility concerns. I've covered these points for the most part, but shame is somewhat subjective. Someone can feel ashamed when a vegan points out, in a respectful manner, that their actions don't align with their values. Some amount of shame is necessary for society to progress. I do think that there's a difference between toxic shame and productive shame. We can view veganism, advocacy for the people, planet, and animals, and plant-based diets through the lens of intersectionality and not absolutism. I understand that for those of us that care deeply about advocating for the livelihood of animals, why it unlocks such an emotional response when others aren't operating the same way. But I'm afraid that sometimes it deters people even more from learning about sustainable and regenerative agriculture. I agree that we should view veganism through a lens of intersectionality, but what she views as absolutism in this context diverges from the definition of absolutism. As per the definition of veganism, the vegan ethic allows for some amount of wiggle room. Since we live in an imperfect world, it is impossible to cause zero harm to animals. Also, I'm not quite sure what she means here because intersectionality and absolutism are not antonyms. Intersectionality and anti-speciesism are not mutually exclusive. If I'm understanding correctly, she views promoting an abolitionist stance against animal exploitation as absolutism, and promoting reducitarianism as intersectional veganism. As for the second part, the wording here is a bit confusing. By regenerative agriculture, does she mean regenerative plant farming, or is she including what she views as sustainable animal farming? Is she saying that vegans responding with passion and emotion is deterring people from caring about sustainability? I think what she's trying to say is that angry vegans turn people off from even considering reducing their meat consumption. And that is a bold claim. To some degree, it's true that people with extremely poor communication skills hurt the cause they're fighting for. But generally speaking, I think it's unfair to blame social justice advocates expressing anger and passion for other people's apathy and lack of critical thinking. If you're gonna let some angry SJW online deter you from educating yourself about racial justice issues, you're kind of a racist piece of shit. Likewise, if you're gonna let some angry vegan deter you from otherwise reducing your meat consumption, you're a dumbass and an asshole. Progress is better than perfection, and I'd rather see 1 million people taking little steps in the right direction versus 1,000 people doing things perfectly. This frames veganism as perfectionism and absolutism, which is a mischaracterization. When it comes to things like reducing your plastic consumption, I can appreciate this sentiment. But consuming animal products involves a direct victim. To advocate for reducitarianism is to condone a little bit of cruelty and violence. I don't condone any amount of cruelty or violence that can be avoided. Therefore, I'm not going to promote reducitarianism. Oftentimes, people say, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good, and use this idea of progress, not perfection, as a cop-out. Perfect is unattainable. The good is veganism. Veganism as an ethic is attainable. Posts like this reinforce the idea that it's not. I am really proud and admire my vegan friends who've made this commitment for the planet, and their actions are helping fight the climate crisis. However, I won't invalidate the efforts of BIPOC environmental activists who might not be vegan or plant-based yet, or ever, who are fighting against environmental injustice, and I won't be a gatekeeper of what it means to be an environmentalist. There are ways we can work together and think critically about this issue, even if we disagree. In summary, shame the system, not individuals who might not have access to better solutions given the broken system. I'm glad we could end on a point of agreement. I will continue to promote an anti-speciesist message within progressive and eco-conscious circles, but I won't invalidate the efforts of non-vegan environmental activists, and I won't be a gatekeeper of what it means to be an environmentalist. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you next week. Peace out.
Yo, how when me eat them, I wonder when me eat. When me tell them say me no eat no fish, no meat now. How when me eat them, I wonder when me yam. When me tell them say that I'm a vegan man. How when me eat them, I wonder when me eat.